Hi, my name's Ellie Keggin. I'm the Employment Tax Manager for the Adecco Group in the UK. My job focuses around PAYE, employees and contractors. I'm here today to talk to you about some changes for off-payroll workers in the public sector. This is a change coming in from 6th of April this year, and it relates to the way that people are paid when they are contractors working through their own limited companies. So for a brief overview of what I'll be talking about, I'm going to be talking about what the changes are, what the impact of those changes are, why the changes are being made, the timeframes for this legislation, and some FAQs featuring questions we've been asked already. I've referred to the fact that there's different tax treatment whether someone is employed or self-employed. The difference between employment and self-employment is not one of choice, it's a matter of fact, and it's been set out by case law over the last few hundred years. The number of factors looked at for self-employment are very complex. There isn't any black and white rule or regulation that you'll be able to follow for this. HMRC recognise this fact, and that's why they've decided to put together a digital tool. The factors that HMRC will consider include whether you've invested in your business, your ability to make a profit, whether you've got special skills and services. They'll also look at a number of other factors such as substitution. So that would include, are you able to send someone else to do the work that you've agreed to do with your company? As we all recognise, this is incredibly complex. So HMRC's digital tool is called the Employment Status Service. It's currently in beta testing, which means a number of close organisations to HMRC have been given a test version so we can see how it works. Adecco is one of those organisations, and a number of people here are testing the tool. Clearly, it's very close to 6th of April already, so we hope the tool will be fixed and ready well ahead of 6th of April. However, we were expecting the final version to be released at the end of February, and it hasn't been yet. The tool will be used by people who want to show whether someone is inside or outside of IR35. It being such a complex area of case law, this tool is intended to help people who aren't specialists in the area. We recommend that people do use the tool once it's ready. It will help you to have a piece of paper that shows to HMRC that you've made the right choice. First, I'll talk about the reasons for the legislation and how the legislation works. This legislation, often referred to as the IR35 legislation, addresses the way that people are taxed. There's a difference between the way a self-employed person is taxed as opposed to an employed person. For example, a self-employed person is likely to pay a lot less national insurance, and if they have their own company, what we refer to as a personal services company, they're likely to pay themselves in dividends, and that has a lower tax rate than earned income tax does. HMRC believe that many people are self-assessing as being self-employed, and so paying the tax of a self-employed person, when in fact, for tax purposes, they're an employee. As such, they believe that 90% of the people who should be paying employment taxes through this IR35 calculation are in fact paying tax as a self-employed person. They've therefore decided to introduce some new legislation which moves the requirement to operate this tax away from that person's personal service company and onto the fee payer, the person who pays them. So now I'm going to tell you all about the impact of this legislation. What this legislation essentially does is it moves the liability from the contractor with their own personal services company to a fee payer. Fee payer has been defined in the new legislation as the person making the payment to that PSC. So for us as an agency, where we have a public sector client, we're an agency in the middle, and then we move on to pay a limited company, we are the fee payer because we're paying a limited company. So that responsibility now sits with us to determine whether someone is inside or outside of IR35 and to operate and deduct tax and NIC where they are inside IR35. This is a really big change for the whole of our sector and is going to affect everyone where the client is a public sector client and all contractors. The IR35 legislation was introduced in 1999. There's therefore been a requirement for all contractors to assess their IR35 status since that date. However, HMRC believe that particularly contractors with their own personal service company, they are not tending to do this correctly. They've therefore decided to move this to a number of people where it's much easier. So it's much easier for one agency to have to deduct lots of tax than it is for HMRC to come after individual personal service companies. At the moment, that liability stays with that personal service company, but any payments made from the 6th of April will be under this new legislation. That means that you might be carrying out work now, but where payment isn't made until after 6th of April, you will be caught. The first option would be a statement of work contract. This is a contract that instead of having either hourly or daily payment is based on the delivery of a project. That project can be split into a number of milestones. Each milestone will need to be signed off by the client before the contractor is paid. You'll note this is quite different to our standard terms and conditions currently. These would be based on hourly payments and timesheets. A timesheet would not be relevant for a statement of work because it's the delivery of a project. For example, instead of hiring someone as an IT manager who delivers IT on a daily basis and works every day, you might hire someone to deliver a new IT system. The end of the project is clear. Once the system has been rolled out, it's finished and the payment will be made. The second would be the option of having a standard contract with your personal services company. However, that's found to be outside IR35. From Adecco's perspective, we'd be looking for HMRC to have agreed with their view that it is outside IR35, as the liability would be sitting with us as the fee payer to pay any PAYE and NICs due. With these contracts, we'd be looking to use HMRC's digital tool, which I'll talk a little bit about later, and we'd want to see the results of that digital tool showing that you're outside IR35. This tool essentially is a survey, and it asks a number of questions relevant to the company, how they provide the services, substitution, and a number of other factors that HMRC would consider relevant. The third option would be to do a deemed payment contract. This contract essentially is where nothing else changes except that the legislation comes in on the 6th of April. Payments from this date made to any PSC, so that limited company of that contractor, would require PAYE to be deducted. In addition to those deductions, we as the fee payer would have employment costs. That include employer's NIC, the apprenticeship levy, which also starts on the 6th of April, as well as standard working time regulations pay. This would therefore require that the payment would deduct those employment costs, and after that we deduct the PAYE and the NIC for the contractor. So they'll, instead of receiving that gross amount, they'll receive a much smaller amount. PAYE will be paid over to HMRC, and the rest of the payment will be paid direct to the PSC. So it won't go to the individual, the worker, it will in fact go to that limited company. That limited company will then be able to make certain deductions in their corporate tax return for that PAYE that's been deducted. The fourth and fifth options are relatively simple, as they're options that we already have in place today. The fourth is using an umbrella company. This is where the umbrella company actually employs the contractor, so they're no longer self-employed. That umbrella will operate PAYE in full, including NIC, and will deal with all employment costs. We already have this set up and the processes are relatively simple. This will end up with the contractor receiving less pay than they do currently, but it will probably be quite similar to them using the deemed payment contract. As such, it's likely that many PSCs will choose to move to the umbrella route. The fifth and final option is to have PAYE through Adecco, straight through. They'll join our payroll, they'll be PAYE through us. It's very simple and easy. Again, they'll probably receive slightly less than they would if they'd gone through their PSC before April. So what are the timeframes for this new legislation? You'll notice I've been referring to April. This legislation comes into place on the 6th of April. This may come as a surprise to some people, as it's very, very soon. HMRC have been insistent since releasing a consultation in the summer last year that this has given us plenty of time to prepare. You'll note, however, that we don't actually have final legislation at this stage. We're still in consultation on the details of the legislation. However, we only have a few weeks to implement. So you'll need to start talking to your contractors, you'll need to start talking to your clients, everyone needs to start making decisions on how they want to address this legislation. So what happens if something goes wrong? This new legislation requires the public sector end client to tell the fee payer whether the person is inside or outside of IR35 for tax purposes. If they don't do this, then that fee payer, so that's Adecco in this case, they have to write a written note, a written requirement to that client to ask them to tell them whether the person is inside or outside of IR35. If they don't respond within 31 days, then the PAYE liability passes to that end client. Clearly, with the placement of temps, we have to work usually within much smaller timescales than a month, so we wouldn't expect this to apply in most cases, and people will need to have processes in place to communicate these differences between the client and the fee payer and the contractor. In addition to the written notice requirements, the PAYE liability can also move to the client in the event that they give fraudulent documentation showing that someone is outside IR35 when they know this not to be true. Again, we don't expect this to come up in the normal running of business. Inevitably, many of people have asked us what they can do to be outside IR35. There is no magic bullet, there's no simple way to get outside of these rules. The reason is that it's based on case law and it's very complex law. We have, however, been told by HMRC that with their tool, where a contractor in a certain contract has in fact placed a substitute for themselves, that's been agreed, they've been paid by that contractor, then the tool should indicate they're outside IR35. Unfortunately, what we can't do is help you get outside IR35. This would be considered to be avoiding tax. We can tell you how to set up a contract and we can provide you advice on how we could go about doing that in a certain way. What we can't do is fix this issue for you. So what do you need to do about this? If you're a public sector end client, you'll need to have a think about who you currently have placed via agencies and whether they're likely to be caught inside IR35 or not. You should also be discussing with your agency what you'd like to do to approach this. Would you like, for example, to use statement of work contracts? These are likely to be more complex and more difficult for you to do. However, they will take people outside of IR35. Would you rather move everyone to PAYE or to umbrellas? This is up to you and something you should be discussing with your contact as soon as possible. In addition, you'll need to be considering what kind of process you have for making sure that you've made these assessments and that you're communicating them to the agencies. Thirdly, you'll need to consider what to do. You may find that you've got some people who are taking home less take-home pay and they want to leave the work. This could be difficult and lead to a skills shortage for you, so you should consider what to do if this is likely to come up. You should also be speaking to your providers, your agencies, to confirm that they're actually compliant with the legislation. We've heard from some smaller agencies that they might consider everyone to be outside of IR35. We think this is unlikely to be compliant and likely to lead to issues with HMRC. What do you need to do as a contractor? Firstly, we strongly recommend you speak to your own tax advisor or accountant as soon as possible. You should discuss with them whether the kind of work you do is likely to be caught by IR35 and the consequences for you and what to do about any tax deducted. You should also be discussing with them whether it's likely that a project-style statement of work contract might suit your work or not. This won't work for everybody, but it might work for you. In addition, you might want to look at your prior year tax returns. HMRC may consider you to have been inside IR35 in prior years, and this is something that's been sitting with you as your own personal tax risk. Again, please discuss this with your accountant or tax advisor. Once you've discussed everything with your accountant and worked out where you are personally, please speak to your contact at your agency. Your consultant will be able to speak with you and talk you through what options are available. There are a number of options available, but your client may only be accepting some of those options. For example, some clients may choose not to accept any more PSCs directly. You may think that it's easier for you to go through an umbrella or PAYE, as after these tax deductions through the deemed employment payment, you'll actually be in a very similar financial position to the position you're in through your PSC. Alternatively, you may think that you're a good subject for the statement of work contract, in which case you should discuss this again with your consultant. Finally, we've prepared a number of communications both for our contractors and our clients. Please contact us and ask for these. These set out the changes in nice simple terms and will help you with your discussions.